Well, if I may have everyone's attention, we're going to get started. Thank you all again for being and spending the afternoon here with us. Thank you, Mr. Abdullah, for joining us for this conversation that we're having. And not that anyone needs a reminder, but if you have friends out there who don't have anything that they're doing this evening, remember 5 o'clock at Gaston should be a really fun time. Our final panel today has two individuals who, in some sense, really require no introduction, in that they've both become synonymous with high-level commentary on India, Pakistan, and of course Kashmir. But allow me to do them the courtesy of an introduction. Let me start on my left with Christine Fair, who's an assistant professor in the Security Studies program here at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. Well on her way, though, to being associate professor, I should add. So just a matter of a little time. Christine has a PhD from the University of Chicago. She has written a book that is going to be a must-read for many years and decades to come, the Pakistani Army Fighting to the End, in which she makes a provocative and extremely plausible argument that the way the Pakistani military establishment has chosen to define victory is essentially that as long as it keeps fighting, it is victorious. A particularly pessimistic conclusion from the perspective of finding solutions to some of the seemingly intractable problems that affect India and Pakistan. Stephen Cohen is arguably one of the dean of South Asia scholars in Washington, D.C. For a long career, he has offered the very best commentary on India, on Pakistan, and on South Asia more generally. There are a few people who enjoy, I would argue, the respect he does both within the academy and within the policy establishment. He is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, has a PhD from the University of Wisconsin, and did his undergraduate work also at Chicago. The idea behind this final panel is to have them, in a sense, react to each other, but also to offer their own perspectives on what they see at today in Kashmir and where the potential for both trouble but also maybe hope might come from. And then, if we have time permitting, we'll open it up once again to you for questions. Without further ado, I'll ask Stephen to get us started with this conversation, and then Christine will offer some her perspective, and then we'll chat.
Yeah, thank you, Irfan. Let me say, before I say anything else, I'm happy to be back at Georgetown. I was a faculty member here for a couple of years, and now this is a new building. I can't lost my way coming here. But I think that Georgetown, especially with this event, and perhaps other events, could take the lead on the East Coast of having a conference which could be of national or international importance. And I've been arguing actually with one of your earlier deans that Georgetown should take the lead in establishing a South Asia current events conference, a recent contemporary South Asia conference. Nobody does this. Wisconsin doesn't do it. Berkeley doesn't do it. Deal with economic, political, strategic issues. Do the culture stuff also. But I think that this could be, because of the location in Washington and the staff and the faculty now, I think we're well equipped to do that. Let me say that I've listened to I've listened to many of the presentations, and I agree with most of them. I don't have any strong disagreements. Some of my former students have spoken. I think.
You can pull the mic up a bit.
Pardon?
If you can pull the mic up a bit.
Okay, yeah. But not everything has been said. I think what's absent, and this goes to some of Chris's work, and a lot of my work, is a strategic sense on South Asia and Kashmir. It was one of a string of failed partitions by the British. Maybe the first one was partitioning America from Great Britain. Clearly, it could be literally what happened was Cornwallis and his crew picked up camp here and went off to India, dominated India. That's how the Indian Army was created, by royal officers from America. Literally, literally took a staff with them, wound up in India. And in a sense, India was success because they knew don't allow the colonists to arm, keep them unarmed, and the Indian Army was a monopoly power. Then, of course, the Pakistan Army split up. But the really critical failure with the British, both in their occupation of America, but also Palestine, Malaya, and so forth, was really the partition. And in my dissertation research, I interviewed about 25 retired former Indian Army officers from Conclave had been a viceroy at one point, and all of them said the same thing. that the partition was a huge mistake. Each blamed somebody else for the mistake, but it was a huge mistake because the argument of Walkenlak and others was, once you divide the subcontinent strategically, there's going to be hell to pay. I know of only one Indian politician of any consequence who actually wanted partition to take place, and that was B.R. Ambedkar. Now, Ambedkar had it right. This fits into your work, Chris. He said, get the Punjabi generals out of India. Get the Punjabi soldiers out of India. Get them into Pakistan. That was the basis of his argument. He did not want Punjabi Muslims dominating India, because they might not have. But the partition was a failure in two respects. The British inherited the Mughal strategy. And the Mughal Empire had created a strategy whereby India, which was their home base, became their home base, from which they would get reconquered where they came from. India stabilized the region around it and also managed relations with the princely states. And there's been two enormous failures since then. One, of course, is Kashmir, the last princely state standing, complete failure in a sense, the source for this meeting. The other failure was Afghanistan. That is, India and Pakistan have been at war with each other in Afghanistan. The Indian view is the enemy, my enemy is my friend. Actually, the enemy, my enemy may be my enemy. That's, it may turn out that Afghanistan isn't so friendly. But they've been competing for power in Afghanistan and Kashmir. So in a sense, from a strategic perspective, what went wrong was a bad partition by the Brits. And the Indians sort of varied in their reaction to this. Nehru thought that Pakistan would collapse. His contempt for what was Pakistan actually encouraged the Pakistanis to be more of a state. And once, of course, they lost East Pakistan, they got nuclear weapons, which ensured their survival indefinitely. Nobody's going to attack a nuclear weapons state. That's what Saddam Hussein failed to learn. So I think that if you look at it from a strategic level, there's not much you can do about Pakistan except Kashmir, except India-Pakistan dialogue. I think that is happening. My argument has been for years now, even when I was in the government, the U.S. and outside power should stay out of it. Let the Indians and Pakistanis talk. From an American perspective, I would argue that American policy should be to promote cooperation in Afghanistan. It's beginning to happen slowly, very slowly. The Pakistanis and the Indians want the same thing in Afghanistan. That is a neutral, non-aligned state. So do the Iranians, so do the Russians and the Chinese. The problem was these two odd couples that could not cooperate in Afghanistan. One was U.S. and Iran, and the other was India and Pakistan. I hope the nuclear deal may have fallout and that we can cooperate with Iran on Afghanistan. That's it's a risk, but they have an interest in a stable, non-extremist Afghanistan, or non-Wahhabi Afghanistan. And of course, India and Pakistan may be moving in that direction. I think Alyssa Harris wrote a paper on this, which you mentioned, making the argument that American policy should be to encourage, in a sense, the reunification of the strategic unity of South Asia, which is India-Pakistan cooperation. I believe that maybe 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that Kashmir could come up as a possible, the problems of Kashmir will diminish. We talked about a lot. But my strategy would be wait on Kashmir, but encourage these kinds of non-official dialogues. I think Georgetown took the lead. I'd like to see these kind of conversations go around everywhere. Not funded by the ISI, but spontaneous by students. I won't talk about gold now, be fine here at all, but clearly it was the wrong approach to take. What I see on both sides is the other people having a shared vision of the future. It consists largely of rock music, but it's a shared vision. And I think that should be encouraged. Let the younger people who don't have the hang-ups of their parents and grandparents to move ahead. With that, let me just stop.
All right. So thank you, Irfan. And also thank you, Steve. Steve for those of you who haven't had the privilege of working with Steve, I think has mentored virtually everyone that's worked on South Asia. And although I've never formally worked with you, you have been just an awesome mentor. You helped me do my book. We love Steve. But, oh, sorry. Everyone loves Steve because Steve is just an awesome mentor. And I've been very privileged to know Steve for many years. So maybe as a point of conversation, I'm going to offer maybe an orthogonal set of options to what Steve has put forward. So as Steve mentioned in my book, Fighting to the End, I make the argument using Pakistan's own defense literature. So in other words, they've got no one to blame but themselves for publishing this stuff. That their interest in Kashmir is not about strategic concerns. In all of the years of looking at the Pakistan Army Journal, never once saw an article where the Pakistan Army said, we need Kashmir because of water security, the ridge line, the LOC isn't tactically defensible. No such argument whatsoever. Instead, they couch their arguments about Pakistan's claim to Kashmir in ideological terms, around the two-nation theory, full stop. They're fighting to the last Kashmiri for their ideology. And not only that, you can either use the strategic culture approach that I use, and by the way, my idea of using the source of literature, their literature actually came from Steve. I think Steve is the only other person. I think Akil Shah in his book has also made some use of it. It's a very underutilized trove of data. But you can use the institutional, the strategic culture literature that I did, or you can make a materialist argument. No matter what argument you use, it's equifinite, you come to the same conclusion that the Pakistan Army has no interest in there ever being peace with India, full stop. And there's just loads of data to point to this. Nawaz Sharif, the Lahore bus diplomacy, Musharraf wrecks that with Kargil. When Zardari finally talks about putting the MFN on the table to reciprocate something that India did in the 90s, the Pakistan Army starts beheading people in Kashmir. And we've seen what Kiani as well as Raheel Sharif has done with respect to Nawaz Sharif and his efforts to seek rapprochement. He basically brought out Dumb and Dumber, also known as Qadri and Khan, to emasculate his government. And by the way, the tactic of Dumb and Dumber was also used in the final throes of the Zardari government to get the PPP to promise to step down a day earlier than they were supposed to do per their mandate. So, the Army has a huge institutional claim in making India the Hindu enemy that seeks to destroy, dismantle, decapitate, whatever, subjugate an Islamist Pakistan, who is the only country that has the kapure to stand up to this Indian hegemon. And so, I actually think that the U.S., it's time for us to think very differently about this region. You cannot reform an ideological state with the tools that we have. So I've argued very strenuously in recent writings that we need to just treat Pakistan like a normal state. It doesn't mean pull up the embassy and go home, but it does mean stop the nonsense of a strategic dialogue. It's not strategic, it's not a dialogue. And certainly stop the big aid. So we may not be able to transform Pakistan's behavior with respect to using terrorism as blackmail under a nuclear umbrella, but at least we don't have to suffer the indignity of subsidizing it and even subsidizing the death of our own troops in Afghanistan. So how does this play into Kashmir? So I've actually, over several years, I've really come to think about the Kashmir problem very differently. And I think we need to stop thinking about it as an international dispute. I think this has become part of the rhetoric, and we don't even think twice about it. Every presidential candidate says Kashmir is the most dangerous place on earth. It's the most dangerous place on earth because we indulge Pakistan's belief that it is any play in the game. Pakistan, I don't care what it is, there is historically no claim that Pakistan has on that part of Kashmir administered by India. At this point, there'll be some Pakistani who says, but the plebiscite. And I say, have you ever read UN Security Council Resolution 47, passed in 48? The answer is inevitably no. There are YouTube videos of me slaying these people who do this. Please Google it, sir. It's always a he. Read it, please. And then you'll realize how that is the most moronic thing that you've offered today. So I think that we need to stop thinking this is an international dispute. And basically, instead of framing this as an India-Pakistan conflict, we really frame it as two internal conflicts, right? Delhi and Srinagar, and Islamabad are actually Rawalpindi, depending if we're looking at GHQ or whether we're looking at APARA, and its relationship with Muzaffarabad. And by decoupling it, making it not an international dispute, we do two things. The first thing we do is that we stop rewarding Pakistan for terrorism. If it even had a moral or ethical argument to make in Kashmir, it's been vitiated by their support of these Islamist terrorists who don't even respect Kashmirians, right? Let's be very blunt about who these terrorists are that they're sending into Kashmir. They're sending in Wahhabis. Well, they're not, LADs is not Wahhabi, that's a misunderstanding, but Lashkar-e-Taiba is LADs, and these Deobandis are, of course, absolutely terrible, and we've looked at some of the things that they've done with throwing acid on women's faces, the destruction of Sufi shrines. So these guys are bad news. And they only use Kashmir instrumentally to get at India through the communal issue. And of course, this is facilitated by the Hindutwadi nutters that are dominating the political discourse today in India. So by taking away this bilateral or international patina, we're in a better position to encourage Delhi and Islamabad/Pindi to deal with this Kashmiri issue as an international affair. And I want to be very clear, I mean, India's track record in Kashmir is well known. I'm not in any way, what's the word I'm looking for, relieving India of any burden to treat its Kashmiris like the citizens it claims to be. But I'm also going to put the blame on Islamabad and Rawalpindi for basically treating its Kashmiri population like a zoo that can be used for jihad and a pawn for political purposes. So Pakistan never gets the inadequate amount of bad credit for mistreating its own Kashmir population. So I'm going to argue that if we really care about human security in both of these parts of Kashmir administered by India and Pakistan respectively, the only way forward is to do what we all know, is to basically ratify the LOC as the international border. And the US can do this in a couple of ways. One, stop calling it an international dispute. Stop recognizing it as a disputed border. Two, using our adequate military and economic assistance to Pakistan to incentivize that. I've written very clearly, it makes no sense for us to give Pakistan helicopters and strategic systems like F-16s when, in fact, the biggest source of a conflict with India are the terrorists that they continue to grow, nurture, man, and mission. So why are we giving Pakistan these weapon systems when, in fact, they're causing the very conflict itself? So I don't see any value in rewarding Pakistan for its malconduct. And if we really care about the quality of life of Kashmiris, I think we're better off decoupling this and treating it as two internal disputes. And we know how India and Pakistan are on these issues. I think we're much better encouraging them quietly, but very diligently. And I think Obama has said some of the right things, certainly to Modi, that they need to treat their citizens as citizens. I think that's the best way we can use our resources to advance human security in this region.
Thank you. Whenever Christine talks, I feel like I need a nap right after it because I'm so tired just trying to keep up with the flow of ideas. But that was amazing, and it was, I think, both of you have delivered what was promised, which is, a very broad sweep in a very short amount of time. I imagine that the comments made have engendered a lot of questions. If there are, feel free to raise your hand. We'll bring you a mic. While we're waiting for those hands, I have a question for both of you in a sense. So I guess the first question that we haven't really talked a lot about today is the potential role of China moving forward. Right, one is beginning to hear a lot more about China's role in Pakistan, in Pakistani-administered Kashmir, and potentially building an oil pipeline between Iran and Pakistan, etc. So this strikes me as a potential, to use your phrase, Christine, really bad news going forward if this sort of further empowers Pakistan, or of course if the US were eventually to take your advice, to effectively give Pakistan another sort of mentor, as it were, that dilutes any leverage that the United States may have. So any thoughts on China would be one. And the second question is, in thinking about these solutions, of course, one of the things that the international relations literature talks about a lot is the role of spoilers, right? And I was thinking back to Lisa's commentary earlier this afternoon, and thinking about a lot of these terrorist groups as having great incentives to ruin any sort of peace that statesmen might achieve. How do we empower these statesmen? I mean, is there any hope that they can look past, say, another 2611, right? I mean, that the peace that seems to be approaching, and then something like that, right, derails the process. How do we sort of, undergird a peace process that is immune to provocation? So those are just two thoughts.
Irfan, the last book I wrote, or next previous book, was called Shooting for a Century, 1947-2047. And my conclusion, glum as it was that this conflict is going to go on until 2047. And one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons was that on each side, there were sports who would take advantage, did not want to see a settlement. And they could always mess things up, and I think the Mumbai attack may have been there, either out of control operatives or state direction. But there were plenty of opportunity for spoilers to reckon. My view is that this is a conflict which is not unique, but analogous to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That is, each side feels that it's a threatened minority, even the Indian side. And therefore, it's hard to get these things resolved, and they have sort of perpetual motion, conflict machines. That's why I agree with Chris, that the U.S. policy should be to come out and say, well, everybody agrees it's going to be the line of control. It will be the line of control. That's American policy, and let everybody adjust around themselves.
China?
China, I used to think that China had no real role in this, but the Indian Army persuaded me that a China-Pakistan linkage did present a strategic threat to India. But on the other hand, China sees the role in Afghanistan perhaps the way we should have seen it, as a diplomatic issue. And I'm not quite sure whether the Chinese PLA makes policy independent of the Chinese government. That may be true in some instances, may not be true. But I do think that the Indians have something to worry about, a linkage between China and Pakistan up in the north up there. And then because what's at stake is not so much territory or people, but water. That's a huge issue for all countries involved. And as China begins to dam some of these rivers, India is a downstream country, and so is Pakistan. So there's a joint India-Pakistan concern about getting China into a dialogue about river and water management.
Chris?
So I have a somewhat different view on this whole spoiler issue. So, like for example, we know Mumbai wasn't a spoiler, right? We now know from David Headley Coleman and everything else that this was straight up ISI. We know that, in fact, David Headley Coleman was himself an entrepreneur. He couldn't get LET himself to buy off on his idea until he got picked up illegally transiting through Khyber. He runs into an ISI officer and he says, hey, don't arrest me, I have a plan to sell you. So we actually know now what we did not know in November 2008, that this was ISI planned really from the time that the ISI meets Headley. So from my view, the Pakistan Army, God, they are so clever. They are a self-licking ice cream cone. They love to cultivate the idea that these guys are off the reservation, that these are snakes no longer in the aquarium. And doing this is actually quite clever, because it actually raises the cost of renting them in, right? They can actually extract more rents from us. Oh, this is so very, very difficult. You have no idea how hard it is. And so by cultivating the idea that they're not on the reservation, it increases their bargaining power. I encourage all of you who know Urdu to read the terrorist Twitter feed. I read them every single day. If you want to know what GHQ is thinking on Yemen, read Jamaat al-Dawa's Twitter feed. You have to do this. You absolutely must. It's ironic that these terrorist organizations are allowed to tweet at will when people who have set up parody accounts. My friend Halfiz Saeed, he was actually banned from Twitter because they thought he was a real terrorist, but the actual terrorist is allowed to tweet. So the spoiler issue, I think, plays to Pakistan's advantage in particular. Now, India has been incredibly insouciant about its domestic issues. And Irfan, you and I have talked about this in the past. For the longest time, the issues of Kashmir remained disconnected from the Hindutva politics of the plains. And now you have a very real problem. And I think you said this yourself in a meeting that the Suture Committee report gave India's Muslims something to hang on, something empirical to say, look, we are this badly off. And you have, I think, a real opportunity for groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba to do as they've done, which is set up proxies in the Indian Mujahideen. And the farther these proxies can get away from ISI, the more plausibly deniable it will be that any attack came from the ISI. So when I sort of think about what can we do to manage this spoiler issue such as it is, on the Indian side, they've got to get their law enforcement act together. I think the biggest tragedy of Mumbai, apart from the fact that 10 terrorists did what they did, was that the Indian law enforcement and the national security guards and every other apparatus was inept. It was a human tragedy, right? We can go through the corruption that undergirded the personal protective equipment of the police and the chief of the anti-terrorism unit who was killed. And we know about the corruption that went into the purchasing of those arms. So we know about the corrupt police. I mean, this is well known. And we know that states in India do not execute their police budgets, right? They have more money than they can execute. Why? Because the politicians like having them as their personal lashkars. So until police reform gets real in India, Mumbai will always, by the way, maritime security, all the things that came out, these vulnerabilities are still there. Intelligence has to get real. So that India can in real time sort out, is this ISI or is this actually a spoiler? And if it is ISI, I don't think India should be in Susian. The only thing that will make Pakistan stop this nonsense is if it bears the cost of its behavior. Right now, the US gets in there whenever there's a terrorist attack. Please calm down, India, please calm down. And then we say, Pakistan, please make some lies. Say you're corralling the terrorists to make India. Give them an excuse to back down. We need to stay out. And we need to signal to the Pakistanis, if you do this, you will bear the consequences of your action, full stop. Because this is game theory 101, right? Pakistan is basically playing this game and maximizing its rents. On the Pakistan side, I don't know how to put this more bluntly. We need to enforce our own laws. Right now, all the aid that we're giving to Pakistan is under a waiver. Secretary Kerry has completely made a nuisance of ourselves by completely overlooking the release of Lukhvi. Hillary Clinton herself, as far as I'm concerned, perjured herself in March of 2011 when they said Pakistan was in compliance with the Kerry-Lugar-Berman security conditionalities. So we need to really, I think, view this spoilers. I don't think India should just lay back and take it every time there's a Mumbai-like attack. On the China, and by the way, India will have to think about what does it mean that what are the military options that it needs to have to respond to certain kind of Pakistani provocation? Something between do nothing and do everything. And the lesson of Kargil is that small wars, limited conflicts are possible. That's the lesson from Kargil, right? So India is going to have to really think about what is in its suite of responses, everything from covert. I'm a big fan of Ajit Doval. That's probably the only thing I'm a fan of in this government. But everything from really nasty covert operations to some version of cold start should be on the table. China, I actually think, is actually really an interesting actor. Because from China's point of view, Pakistan is a check that's bounced twice. And it's about to bounce thrice, right? It understands the Pakistan problem. And, and it uses Pakistan to take a punga with India, right? So when the Pakistanis say, you use us to screw Afghanistan, well, the Chinese use you to screw the Indians. Maybe you should stop being an instrument of screwing a little bit more. So the Chinese, they have a very clear tap with Pakistan. But they also aren't going to buy them out, right? They give Pakistan basically loan aid. We're the only one that gives them a free ride with grant aid. And China has
We don't give them credit.
No. We give, look at what,
Military aid?
look at what the ESF, the economic security monies that we've been giving. Alan Cronstadt compiles this. It's about a third of the total that we've given them. And then CSF is, of course, fungible. So what's interesting about China, and Steve, you have the best quote about China. We're fighting to the last Marine to make Afghanistan safe for Chinese exploitation. It's true. The Chinese will not get the copper out of Anat unless there's a railway, right? And China is actually, I think, one of the only places that the Tibetan Railway is they have the capability of building railways in Afghanistan, and they don't care how many Chinese die. They simply don't care. So China actually has enough commercial interest in both Afghanistan and Pakistan to care in a way that we won't. And we are unable, I think, to process China's role because of the policy lenses that we see with the region, right? We mostly deal with Afghanistan through CENTCOM, but it's PACOM that deals with China. So PACOM sees China as the big nasty threat, but CENTCOM sees where China is actually playing a useful game. So I think we have to find a way of working with China more closely, at least in this region.
Chris, I would disagree with you, I may disagree with you on one point. I think that when the TTP, which had been supported more or less by the ISI, started attacking the Pakistan army, there began a process which we should encourage, and the process was reconsideration by the army of the use of terrorists. Now, so far, they've agreed that they will stop supporting terrorists that are attacking them, but they haven't said anything about those who are attacking India, or terrorists, or whatever you want to call them. And I think that began a process in the army, especially when they showed videos of Pakistan army officers being beheaded by these guys, rethinking their role. And like Cannon, I agree that in the case of Pakistan, like the Soviet Union, we need a containment policy, which doesn't mean cutting them off or making them an enemy, but managing them, because like Soviet Union, they're a nuclear weapon state. They actually do help us, and the Chinese occasionally, and even the Indians occasionally. So I think it's not an either-or thing. Even the ISI, it's not clear to me whether the ISI runs Pakistan or whether the army runs ISI. Who's in charge? ISI people I've met in the past, I met good ones and I met bad ones. Same with some intelligence people. or Indian raw people. Some were more sensible than others, but I think that we should be trying to influence that debate within Pakistan. And as I can see, younger Pakistanis clearly are on the side of more forthright Pakistan policy towards Kashmir, towards India. And the one senior general who said this, besides Karamat, was Musharraf. I met Musharraf right after his coup. He went down the road on Kashmir all the way to the end. I was astonished, scribbling does, but I was astonished how he wanted a dialogue, peace with India, Kashmir, and he talked about things that came up later. Then an officer sitting with him said, "Sir, our policy is plebiscite." So Musharraf stood up, was stated, we can't, no, we have to have a plebiscite first, then we'll do it. But he then changed his mind and actually began moving down that road. Others in the army I talked to at the time were not so sure about it, but they said, if the Indians want to go that way, we'd be happy to go too. But we don't trust them, in a sense. The Pakistan army is based on fear of India. But given that, more than half your population was taken away from you by Indian arms, there's, as well as Pakistani incompetence, there's basis for that.
Two-finger intervention on this. They're going after the TTP. I agree we should encourage this, but we should also be really clear about how they're doing this. So remember the TTP, they're all Deobandi. And I hate to go into nomenclature, but it's really important to understand that the Deobandi interpretive tradition, they share an infrastructure of mosques, madrasas, and who's in this umbrella? You have the Afghan Taliban, you have Jaish-e-Mohammed, Huji, Hua, Hum, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, SSP, now operating under ASWJ, and a whole alphabet soup of killers, all right? So what they've been trying to do, and of course how did the TTP come into being in the first place? They came from elements of these different groups who turned against the state because they objected to the Pakistani alliance with the US to bring down the only Deobandi Sharia state that's ever existed, the Afghan Taliban. And through their co-location with the Taliban, they became very close with Al-Qaeda. So after 9/11, these Deobandi groups became basically the outsourcers of Al-Qaeda. So the attack on the US consulate in Karachi was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, that is to say Al-Qaeda in imagination, but LEJ in execution. So you have to look very carefully at what Pakistan's been doing. So much of this negotiation powwow with the Afghan Taliban has also been about convincing elements of the TTP to go back and kill in Afghanistan, to kill us and to kill our allies and mostly to kill Afghans. You have to also take a look, if you've ever again followed Jaish-e-Mohammed, the reinvention of Jaish-e-Mohammed and Masood Azhar in Bahawalpur. That organization was largely dead for quite some time. The ISI recuperated it. Why? To take away those elements of the TTP that would be willing to go back to a Deobandi terror organization and kill Indians. And the residual are the ones that will not, in other words, the residual are the ones that cannot be reconciled through coercion or co-optation. And these are the ones that they're killing. So this means that these terrorists, it's like a water balloon, right? You squeeze them here, they're going to squirt someplace else. You squeeze them. So until Pakistan, this is why I say, the idea that Pakistan can just round up some snakes and wring their necks, whatever you do to snakes, but not the rest of them, it's not going to work because they share this ideology, this architecture. They have overlapping membership with each other, and they have overlapping membership with the JUI, right, which is the Deobandi Ulama Party. So Pakistan cannot selectively groom or mow parts of the TTP grass while letting other parts of the lawn flourish with fertilizer. So until I see evidence of this, and by the way, let's talk about this, but what about the Shias? Well, the Shias are also a strategic ally of Pakistan. Why are the Shia in Balochistan, the Hazaras, being slaughtered like it's open season? Because there are deep suspicions that they are a vector for Iranian espionage and influence. Even in Quram, right? So even the sectarian groups, and by the way, let's talk about the beheading. Who's being beheaded in the Pak army? If you watch those videos, the TTP have been calling out Shia members, Shia officers and Shia Jawans. So there's also a Shia patina to this, which brings us back to the Gulf policy, right? If the Pakistanis, for how much money they get from the Saudis, what last spring was 140, it was a ridiculous number. What was it? Do you remember what it was, Raza? How much did the Saudis pay to rent Pakistan's policy last spring?
1.5 billion.
1.5 billion. Yeah. So, in some sense, if you look at who's going to fight IS in Iraq and in Syria, it's the LEJ SSP people, because they're the ones that have this desire to go and slaughter Shia or Alawites. And so even these fellows dovetail into the Pakistani-KSA relationship. So even these people who have killed tens of thousands of Pakistanis, including Pakistan officers and Jawans and frontier corpsmen, are still assets. And oh, by the way, their leadership still fruits about with Nawaz Sharif, with impunity. So I just don't see the evidence of this changing, oh, we see things differently. What I see is more of the same. They want to ride this tiger, and they think they can ride this tiger, but they can't get off this tiger. They just cannot.
When I was in the
Did they
State,
shoot the tiger?
when I,
Drone the tiger?
when I was in the State Department in 85, 87, there were people who were arguing that the Soviet Union was going to go on indefinitely, and shortly thereafter it disappeared. So I think we cannot rule out in the future. Indonesia, when I was a graduate student, was one of the hot topics because Indonesia was the aggressive state in Asia. And the Greeks and the Turks were a good subject for PhD dissertation because that's an eternal conflict. All of these things have changed. I'm not optimistic about Pakistan, which is why my book is pessimistic. I've been pessimistic from this time I started writing about Pakistan. My first book was 1985. But I think that you can't foreclose the future. You can't say this will happen because you don't know what's going to happen. Pakistanis don't know, we don't know. Who would have thought that, I won't talk about details, but
I think that's a really great note on which we don't know the future, but we can help make it. And so hopefully we'll have many more conversations on the
we
future.
don't, Irfan, we don't even know the past. Historians argue among each other about what happened. And the past is prelude to the future, so.
Yes, well, one of the things we'll hope to do at Georgetown is educate ourselves about the past and inform the future. Thank you for helping us get that conversation started. Please join me in thanking Steve. I'm hoping all of you are sticking around for 5 o'clock. If you are, please make your way over to Gaston. We have to register you and check you off for security reasons. But we'd love to have them, in a sense, react to each other, but also to offer their own perspectives on what they see at today in Kashmir and where the potential for both trouble but also maybe hope might come from. And then if we have time permitting, we'll open it up once again to you for questions. Without further ado, may I ask, I'll ask Stephen to get us started with this conversation, and then Christine will offer some her perspective, and then we'll chat.
Yeah, thank you, Irfan. Let me say, before I say anything else, I'm happy to be back at Georgetown. I was a faculty member here for a couple of years, and now this is a new building. I have lost my way coming here. But I think that Georgetown, especially with this event, and perhaps other events, could take the lead on the East Coast of having a conference which could be of national or international importance. And I've been arguing actually with one of your earlier deans that Georgetown should take the lead in establishing a South Asia current events conference, a recent contemporary South Asia conference. Nobody does this.
Well, if I may have everyone's attention, we're going to get started. Thank you all again for being and spending the afternoon here with us. Thank you, Mr. Abdullah, for joining us for this conversation that we're having. And not that anyone needs a reminder, but if you have friends out there who don't have anything that they're doing this evening, remember 5 o'clock at Gaston should be a really fun time. Our final panel today has two individuals who, in some sense, really require no introduction, in that they've both become synonymous with high-level commentary on India, Pakistan, and of course Kashmir. But allow me to do them the courtesy of an introduction. Let me start on my left with Christine Fair, who's an assistant professor in the Security Studies program here at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, well on her way, though, to being associate professor, I should add, so just a matter of a little time. Christine has a PhD from the University of Chicago. She has written a book that is going to...
India was success because they knew don't allow the colonists to arm, keep them unarmed, and the Indian army was a monopoly power. Then of course the Pakistan army split up. But the really critical failure of the British, both in their occupation of America, but also Palestine, Malaya, and so forth, was really the partition. And in my dissertation research, I interviewed about 25 retired former Indian Army officers from Conclave down. Conclave had been a viceroy at one point, and all of them said the same thing, that the partition was a huge mistake. Each blamed somebody else for the mistake, but It was a huge mistake because the argument of Walker and others was, once you divide the subcontinent strategically, there's going to be hell to pay. I know of only one Indian politician of any consequence who actually wanted partition to take place, and that was B.R. Ambedkar. Now, Ambedkar had it right. This fits into your work, Chris. He said, get the Punjabi generals out of India. Get the Punjabi soldiers out of India. Get them into Pakistan. That was the basis of his argument. He did not want Punjabi
To
Muslims.
be a must-read for many years and decades to come. Pakistan army fighting to the end, in which he makes a provocative and extremely plausible argument that the way the Pakistani military establishment has chosen to define victory is essentially that as long as it keeps fighting, it is victorious. A particularly pessimistic conclusion from the perspective of finding solutions to some of the seemingly intractable problems that affect India and Pakistan. Stephen Cohen is arguably one of the dean of South Asia scholars in Washington, D.C. For a long career, he has offered the very best commentary on India, on Pakistan, and on South Asia more generally. There are few people who enjoy, I would argue, the respect he does both within the academy and within the policy establishment. He is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, has a PhD from the University of Wisconsin, and did his undergraduate work also at Chicago. The idea behind this final panel is
Wisconsin doesn't do it, Berkeley doesn't do it, deal with economic, political, strategic issues, do the culture stuff also, but I think that this could be, because of the location in Washington, the staff and the faculty have, I think we're well equipped to do that. Let me say that I've listened to, I've listened to many of the presentations, and I agree with most of them. I don't have any strong disagreements. Some of my former students have spoken. I think,
If you can pull the mic up a bit.
pardon?
If you can pull the mic up a bit.
Okay, yeah, but not everything has been said. I think what's absent, and this goes to some of Chris's work, and a lot of my work, is a strategic sense on South Asia and Kashmir. It was one of a string of failed partitions by the British. Maybe the first one was partitioning America from Great Britain. Clearly, it could be literally what happened was Cornwallis and his crew picked up camp here and went off to India, dominated India. That's how the Indian Army was created, by royal officers from America. Literally, I mean, literally took a staff with them, wound up in India, and in a sense,